Hi everyone, welcome back to What's Your History Textbook Left Out. Today we'll be talking to Glenn Spain of the PCFFA and talking about the Klamath River dam removals.
This is Glenn Spain, S-P-A-I-N. I am the Northwest Regional Director of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations is a coast-wide multi-port association, like a trade association for commercial fishing families. We have 17 different port associations, including some marketing associations, including some that are multi-port, like vessel owner associations. Crab boat owners associations, for instance, includes crab boat owners and crab permit holders up and down the coast, but it is exclusively commercial fishing families. We don't represent the processors. We don't represent the big factory boats. We represent the mom and pop, mostly owner-operated small fishing vessel fleet, about 700 to 900 boats, depending on the season and the fishery, are members in our association. So we're essentially very much like a union operates, but because of the intricacies of labor law in the United States, unions can't be, people who are individual business owners can't form unions, but they do form trade associations that serve in many of the same functions. We coordinate activities, we provide legal advice sometimes to our members on particular issues that they're involved in. We get involved in the public policy arena a lot, both legislative and in comments on various agency issues. Anything related to fisheries. And salmon fisheries, of course, has been the backbone of the West Coast fishery until recently, when all the salmon's seasons have been closed, unfortunately. But wherever salmon go, we have to be there too. And they used to go up above the Klamath dams. So we are also regulated on the basis of the abundance of salmon in the Klamath. And when they started declining because of the dams, we had to start seriously taking that into our view in terms of advocacy. Now, how I personally got involved, I went to law school in San Francisco, and I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, a desert, in the middle of the Yuma Desert. And I had frankly not seen a body of water bigger than a bathtub until I came west at 17 to start going to college. And I had a summer job in San Francisco and fell in love with the coast. Just fell in love with it. And I've spent my life basically in coastal areas working on coastal issues, primarily for our fishing interest, but coastal protection issues in a variety of different capacities. And I have been the general legal counsel for PCFFA for the past 30-some years. And they were a major client of mine for 15 years before that. So I've been with them for about 45 years.
Awesome, yeah. And you kind of touched on a bit of the next point that I want to make, being PCFFA's main mission. As you talked about, it's kind of a trade association of fishermen, right? But what would you categorize the like a one sentence mission statement of the trade association to be?
To protect and further the interests of commercial fishing families coastwide.
Awesome, yeah. And how do you think that kind of relates, how that's changed over time since the founding of the PCFFA, I believe in the 1970s?
Yeah,
And
76, I think, was when we were first founded. Well, originally it was a matter of talking about fish. Uh, and we spent a lot of time advocating for allocations of fish, but it became right about that time we had major oil spills. The Santa Barbara oil spill actually triggered the formation of many fishermen's associations because they suddenly realized two things. Number one, it matters what's in their habitat. It matters to them, their survival, whether the fish survive or not. Number two, these are coast-wide issues. And you can't just address it in a local port association. when you're talking about an oil spill that could be catastrophic over many portions of the coast and could reoccur anywhere. Also, in that era, there was an effort to develop offshore oil to its maximum in the coastal areas without any regard to its impact on fisheries. We got involved in that issue. I got involved actually in law school with the effort of the Department of Navy, the Defense Department, to dump its nuclear submarine reactors. These radioactive reactors have to be carved out and dumped somewhere. They were planning on dumping them right off the Farallon Islands, which is not only a major fishery, but is technically part of the city and county of San Francisco. There was a nuclear waste dump site there in the Farallon Islands left over from World War II and the Manhattan Project. But we got word of that, and the fishermen got word of that, and mobilized myself and a bunch of law students that I mobilized to try to put a stop to it, and we succeeded. That brought me to the attention of the commercial fishing folks, and particularly PCFFA. So right after law school, when I graduated, I also have a background in biology as well, in physics and biology. So they snagged me as their general legal counsel, and I've been working with them in that capacity for many, many years. And for 15 years, I had other clients too, dealing primarily with environmental issues, environmental law, and working with a lot of nonprofit organizations as well that were doing good work in a variety of different areas. But they were also always my main client. And when I moved up to the Northwest with my family, raised a family up here, I bought a small farm in Northern California and then moved further north. They asked me to open the Northwest Regional Office. It is a coastwide organization, but it's difficult to run a coastwide organization from one office in one port, San Francisco. So for the past 30 years, I've basically held down the Northwest Regional Office here. Also, as General Legal Counsel, I manage a lot of our litigation. We have, I think, 26 active cases right now, dealing with impacts on salmon runs, dealing with impacts on other fisheries, dealing with poorly planned offshore oil development, offshore wind development, offshore aquaculture development that are being pushed forward without any consideration for the impact on local indigenous fisheries. People who make their living in their local port should have the right to catch fish and land fish for food in their local communities and be able to make a living at it. That's potentially severely disrupted by efforts to develop the coast. The coast is already developed. It's called a fishery. It's called an ecosystem. But to industrialize large portions of that means pushing fishermen out. So that's some of what we do and some of what I do. Now, the issue of salmon, of course, the life cycle of salmon starts high up in the watershed. So that's where our ocean starts, high up in those watersheds. And the salmon, of course, spawn and rear and lay their eggs in fresh water. Then they come gradually migrating down into the estuary where they adapt to saltwater conditions gradually, and then out to the ocean. Then they return back to the very same space, the very same stream that they were hatched in. No one is, even to this day, quite sure how they know their way, but they do. And it is an amazing ecosystem add-on, if you will, because among other things, those salmon bring back nutrients from the ocean, which they capture for the 3 or so years they're out there. And then they die when they spawn, and they release those nutrients back into the watershed. Most of the Northwest forests are salmon dependent. More than 128 species are salmon dependent up and down the coast. So salmon are a keystone support of major ecosystems. They're also a keystone support of the economies of many coastal communities, or were. Now they're suffering tremendous declines, including this last 3 years of total closure. People have done what they could to adapt to other fisheries. There are many other fisheries our people are involved in, but it's hard to transfer. Your boat may not operate. It's not a crab boat, it's a salmon boat. It's not a trawler, it's a troller. There are different kinds of boats. Regearing is expensive, and permits are not necessarily readily available in one fishery and another. People now do their best to have multiple permits, but it's expensive. They do their best to have boats that can be regeared either way, but that's hard to do. It's expensive. And also salmon, all fisheries are managed state by state. So the rules in one state wouldn't necessarily apply, and you can't, if you're a California salmon permit holder for a commercial fishing permit, you can't just go and fish in Oregon. You have to have a permit in Oregon, and there's a limit on those permits. So you can't necessarily do it. The way fisheries are managed for highly migratory species like salmon is that they're inland in the rivers, they're managed solely by the state. From the beach to about 3 to 6 miles out, depending on where the barriers and borders are in the coastline, those are jointly managed by the federal government and the state, and beyond 6 miles out to 200 miles, they're managed by the federal government through the Secretary of Commerce and through an organization called the Pacific Fishery Management Council, which advises the Secretary of Commerce, contains state representatives, contains tribal representatives. They're tribal fisheries by treaty as well. And they pretty much divvy up what is available fairly as possible with some dickering every year. But what we have seen is fewer and fewer salmon coming back every year. Sometimes up a bit, but then down further, up a little bit, down further. The trend has always been downward for the past 50, 60 years for various reasons. One of those reasons is that we built too many dams in too many places that block salmon. That was particularly true of the Klamath. And the Klamath sits right in the middle of the coast, so salmon from the Klamath would swim north and swim south when they reach the ocean, which means they intermingle with all these other fish from other river systems who might be quite abundant. But as the Klamath fisheries, the Klamath abundance decline, primarily driven by dams, but also water pollution and lack of water. It's an over-appropriated system. There are fewer and fewer Klamath origin salmon mixing in these more abundant stocks. We're bound under the laws of biology as well as federal law to be mindful of weak stock management. We're controlled by weak stock management. So the weakest stock in an intermingling fishery is the cap. If you have 1,000,000 Chinook from the California Central Valley and you have only 40,000 Chinook from the Klamath, that's barely enough to maintain one generation. So you're below the minimum spawner floor. If you drop below the minimum spawner floor in the Klamath, you shut down the whole fishery. We can't afford to take even one Klamath origin fish out of 100 fish that we capture off the California Central Valley.
Was that why they recently shut down the entire fishery operation for salmon?
That was the shutdown in 2006. It was primarily driven by the Klamath. In 2007 and 8, it was driven by weak stock in the California Central Valley. This last 3 years, it's driven primarily by weak stock in the California Central Valley and the Klamath combined, which is why the fishery had to be closed through the whole state and much of Oregon. Klamath salmon, by the way, migrate into Oregon. About halfway up the coast, they're quite abundant. And they migrate all the way down to Monterey. So that area is where we wind up with closures when the Klamath salmon are in the weak stock. And those rules went into effect in 1976, a thing called the Magnuson-Stevens Sustainable Fisheries Act. That did a number of things. It nationalized coastal waters out to 200 miles. We used to have Russian trawlers 3, 4, or 5 miles off coast. That no longer exists. 76, we put an end to that. But it also required that all fisheries be maintained on a biologically sustainable basis. That's when the weak stock management rules went into effect. Now, the declines in the Klamath had been going on and on and on since the last dams were built in the 60s. The first dam was built in 1918. That blocked a lot of the salmon runs. But as you went down river, there were more and more dams. From that point on, it started to go downward trend because they couldn't get back to their spawning ground. And when that downward trend hit the 1976 Magnuson-Stevens sustainability requirements, we had our first major closure in the early 80s, driven by weak stocks in the Klamath specifically. So our people were out of work. And why they were out of work? Because there's something going on in the Klamath. What was going on in the Klamath? Well, nobody really knew in our fishing industry. At that point, I got assigned to find out. And we traced it to declines in the Klamath. And those declines, we traced it to the dams. I started working on that in 1982. We went and passed a thing called the Klamath River Basin Fishery Resources Restoration Act, passed in 1986. So we got an act in Congress saying, yes, it's a mandate to restore the Klamath River, the salmon in the Klamath River. And it gave us a budget of $1 million a year to find out what was wrong and create a salmon restoration plan. That was the first effort, as far as I know, in the West Coast to federally address a salmon decline in a realistic way. The fact that we were off in budget by a factor of 100, we found out later, but right around then, 1986, with the formation of an advisory committee to advise the federal government on how to restore the salmon in the Klamath, my team started advocating for dam removal. And people laughed at us. What? We build dams. We don't remove dams. People absolutely laughed at us. They thought we were nuts. But the science was collected and the data was collected, and it turns out that the dams were not properly designed. For instance, you have no fish ladders at all, no fish passage in the Iron Gate Dam at the bottom of the Klamath, but you have fish ladders for the dams in the middle.
There's no purpose.
Well, no purpose. How can the salmon get there? The structures were built over many decades with no overall plan, and certainly no plan that took into account salmon, nor any of the people who live on the salmon for their livelihoods. That means commercial fishing families up and down the coast. That also means the tribes, the 4 major tribes. The Klamath tribes in the upper basin hadn't seen salmon since the first dam was built. They were blocked. And the salmon were declining more and more every year in the lower river because of the impact of the dams. Not just that the dams block the river for migration, which they do. The lower dam blocked about 420 miles of once viable, abundant stream habitat. That's a lot of miles blocked. So that deteriorates the population, depresses the population. But also, water quality is poor because you've got these big bathtubs full of nutrients that soak up sun. Toxic algae blooms happen, and those are toxic to fish as well as people. They trap sediment. That sediment is needed for gravel recruitment for spawning and rearing grounds. So for 50 miles below Iron Gate Dam, the river is starved of sediment. It's doesn't have the winter flushing flows, so there are parasites that don't get knocked down every winter. A parasite called sea shasta, which lives in a particular worm that lives on rocks that are stable. If they don't turn over in the winter floods, they don't knock the worms off, so you get the parasite, the sea shasta outbreaks. That kills a lot of fish. Just lots of things went wrong. In fact, I would say that everything that can go wrong in a river system went wrong in the Klamath at one time or another. In addition to the fact that there's overappropriation, we'll put a flag in that one. There's too much water taken out of the basin at the top, on top of everything else. That and the dams are the main things that depress the salmon runs in the Klamath. And we've dealt with the dams thoroughly. It took me 35 years from the time I started advocating, almost 40 years advocating for dam removal to get it done. But I'll tell you, when I was there watching the last plug being pulled, there was not a dry eye in the audience. A lot of us have dedicated much of our lives, and some people all of their lives, to restoring the river and restoring the salmon. And the good news is that the river now, in spite of sediment loads initially and things like that, is in better water quality condition, lower temperature, better suited for salmon than it ever was with the dams,
Wow.
just less than a year after the final removal. And something like 5,000 to 6,000 adult salmon were spotted through our sonar and radar moving up, migrating up above where the dams were into upper basin tributaries, which we're in the process of restoring, and they're spawning and rearing. We're getting eggs for the next generation. Those are now imprinted on the upper basin for the first time in 100 years.
Ever since the removal in, I believe, October of 2024, right?
Exactly. The last plug was pulled.
And then
So,
immediately, yeah.
yeah, there was a lot of media. By the way, we got constant calls from TV people to blow something up so they could get a real good picture. And you don't blow up dams. You don't have pieces scattered. That only happens in movies. But we finally arranged to have something blow up so the camera crews could see it. It was a little concrete plug in one of the lower dams. We hit the button, boom. Very small as movies go, but it was at least something blowing up that they could have a nice TV shot of. So anyway, that's my role and a bit about the mission of PCFFA. Relating to past and future commercial fishing, well, we come out of the fishing community. We want to assure that there is a future for the fishing community. And that means we have to do three things. We have to have fish, we have to have habitat to generate fish, and we have to have access to those fish in a fair and reasonable way. And that means the access means we have to have abundant fish, not just a few, not just belly scraping flows by way of habitat. We have to have abundance restored back to these fisheries. And it can be done. There are examples where river systems, thoroughly blasted river systems, have been recovered. We see that in the Elwha, for instance, after the dams were removed there. We see that in the white salmon after another Pacific Core dam was removed there. And we're seeing it in the Klamath, and we're charting it. There's an enormous amount of scientific monitoring going on, looking at before and after. We spent years doing the monitoring, and there are telemetry and radar and sonar and all things stationed in various places so we can do fish counts. We're doing sampling to do water quality sampling constantly. And we're looking at what is going to be a wonderful example of how a river can recover. And by the way, in terms of dams, there's something like an estimated 85,000 dams in the United States that block salmon runs or block fish runs, not just salmon, but fish runs. That is more than one dam for every day since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and a
Wow.
few thousand left for change. Of those dams, the average lifespan of those dams, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, is 57 years. The majority of those are exceeding that average lifespan, and only about 20% of those dams still function for what they were originally designed to do. But they sit there in the rivers, collecting sediment, creating potential flood hazards for catastrophic flooding for rupture. And we're now in the era of paying a price for the infrastructure we built. We have, as a society, a habit of building things without thinking about 30, 40 years down the road. What's it going to look like? What repairs are going to be needed? What do we do to replace it? We're now in that era with dam building. We now have far more dams than we need. Many of them are destructive. Many of them are counterproductive, and quite a few of them are safety hazards. So what we're doing now with the Klamath is not unique. There have been, in the past 50 years, there have been well over 1,000 dams removed in the U.S., and there will be far more because they're all reaching their shelf life. They all have an best of use by date, expiration date. Every one of them. And so that's why what we're doing in the Klamath is so important. And also it sets a model for what's being looked at in the Columbia River, in many other places like the Elk River, the Eel River, Russian River, various places where salmon are blocked unnecessarily by dams that no longer function for what they were intended to do and are actually counterproductive.
Mhm.
So it's not, I've been directly involved. I think this is the 13th and 14th dam removal project. I've been directly involved for PCFFA in removing, I made a list, 4 dams in Battle Creek, Northern California, the Elwha and the Glines Dam, Condit Dam, that's the one in Pacific Dam in uh, Washington, Salmon, Savage Rapids Dam, San Clemente Dam, and now 4 more in the Klamath.
Wow, definitely impressive resume at this point then.
And I'm not expecting to retire until I get at least 6 more down. How's that for a goal?
Yeah, I'm hoping to hit like one in one
Yeah,
in my life. One thing I did want to kind of touch on is you mentioned earlier there are these like kind of delicate balances between the federal government, state government, and tribal governments, especially when it comes to fishing off the coast. In terms of kind of these dam removals, how much of this had to be discussed with tribal governments, and what was the role of tribal governments playing in the entire removal project?
good one. And Klamath is a good example because you have active tribal communities there. You don't have active tribal communities in many other places. You don't even have much in the way of rivers. And Los Angeles River, where you know where the Los Angeles River is? In a culvert under Los Angeles. It's been there for a long time. The Klamath is unique in some ways, but also emblematic in that you have a sparsely populated, very large ecosystem, very rich ecosystem, and you have tribal communities that have been there on their native, mostly their original lands for a long time. The Yurok, the Hoopas, the Karuks are on their original land. Tribes in Oregon were resettled from the Midwest mostly, but there's, I think, 4 different tribal nations that combined their efforts. So you have um, not a lot of big development problems. There are no big cities in the Klamath. The Klamath itself, oh,
Oh yeah, sorry. I just went to I saw the meeting minutes were running out, so I
that
went
may,
to
It's asking you to update. I don't know if you want to do that, but in any event, uh, you have communities that are dependent on the river. They've been dependent on the river for thousands of years, the tribal communities. Um, and there's a tremendous um, opportunity there. But remember, the tribes were, some of them had not been reorganized. The Klamath tribes of Oregon were decertified. They were declared unpeople for a long
Yeah.
time until finally they stayed together and managed to get recertified. The Yurok tribe was not particularly well organized for a long time. They were fighting in the river for fishing rights and succeeded in doing that. That pulled a lot of them together as governments. They had to organize that. And then we came along and said, let's take the dams down. We didn't get much traction at first, but we kept planning for it. We kept building it into our overall restoration plans. We really led the charge in that for many years. But what happened is in 2001, there was a shutdown of the water system in the upper basin because of the needs for fish. That was the first time that the water system run by the Bureau of Reclamation had ever been curtailed to meet the needs of fish. That was because of our lawsuit. The Bureau of Reclamation said, oh, well, we don't have to deal with the Endangered Species Act. It's not our job to do that. We deal with irrigation. Well, there's a relationship there. It's called the river. And we did sue successfully to force them to consult and to create a biological opinion. That's, as you know, in the USA, that's the plan for how you go about not hurting the fish more and hopefully recovering them. So they had to come up with a biological opinion for the coho, which were ESA listed a few years before that. And the Bureau had, up until that time, been cushioning these blows by supplying all the water it needed. But they had to face the fact that there were limits on what could be done for the first time. It was a shock to them, their system. There were demonstrations, there's, civil disobedience, there's calls for the elimination of fish, the elimination of the tribes, the elimination of environmental laws, the elimination of those pesky fishermen. All this stuff hit the fan. But in 2002, when the then Bush administration turned around and gave all the water in the river during a continuing drought to the irrigation system against the advice of their own scientists, there was a massive fish kill. It was the worst adult fish kill in U.S. history. Something like 70,000 spawners, otherwise healthy, spawning, mostly Chinook, some coho, were headed up the river and couldn't get to the spawning grounds because they died in the middle of the river. They died of disease caused by hot water and low flows. So the low flows triggered the hot water. The disease was exacerbated by the dams, but the real triggering there was lack of water. So we had a massive fish kill. I was down there just shortly before that really peaked, and you can't imagine what 40 miles of stinking dead fish in a once healthy river does to you. And the shock it sent to the tribes who were people of the river. In the Yurok language, I'm told, there are only two directions. There's upriver and downriver. They don't have north, south, east, and west like we do. There are two directions. It's all based on the river. So that was a tremendous shock. And from that point on, we were working together with the tribes to try to cure the problems with the river. Before then, we'd actually been in suits with the tribes over allocation issues. There was a famous case, the Paravano case, where our PCFFA president sued because the tribes were being given 50% of the harvest. They don't have a treaty, but other tribes do have a treaty, and the 50% model was sort of imported from treaty tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Well, we were at odds in court. However, my executive director, who is a smart guy, Zeke Grader at the time, and my president, uh, basically said, okay, to the tribes, we'll fight this out in court, but let's all work together on making more fish, on restoring the habitat. We had this bill, and we were all sitting on these councils together trying to develop a restoration plan. Let's see what we can do to work together on these other issues. So we drew a circle around this thing, submitted it to the court. We lost. They won. And then while that was all happening, we were trying to restore the river. We were working through the advisory council, the Klamath River Basin Fishery Resources Advisory Council, working on this, trying to create a plan, trying to get it funded. And that has been our relationship with the tribes ever since. Occasionally we have allocation issues with various groups. That's what the Pacific Fishery Management Council does. They do allocation. Do your best shot, make your case, you live with it, and then you work together on all the other issues in common. I served on the Pacific Fishery Management Council Habitat Committee, and with me were tribal folks, recreational fishing folks, state agencies, federal agency people, all working on the underlying problem, which is habitat destruction for not just salmon fisheries, but lots of other fisheries as well. So that has been our relationship with the tribe. Unfortunately, that's not always been the same relationship between commercial fishing folks and tribes in the Pacific Northwest. They were at odds for decades, which resulted in a lawsuit called the Bolt decision, named after the judge. And that allocated 50% of the harvest to the tribes. And there's still bitter feelings in some places in the fishery over that one in the Pacific Northwest. We don't buy into that at all. Frankly, we're better off teaming up with the tribes because they have a very good moral argument. We have a very good economic argument, and we both have strong legal arguments that restoration should go forward.
Definitely.
We're seeing that play out right now. As you probably know, there was a salmon restoration plan in the Columbia River too, which was just vetoed, axed by the Trump administration. Um, there's no plan up there now. The salmon are still going downhill. The Trump administration doesn't have an alternative plan. We continue working with the tribes. We'll continue working with the state agencies, really pushing that forward because that is the only hope we have for restoring a multi-billion-dollar salmon economy. And we are making that headway in the Klamath, and the Klamath is being used as a model in the Pacific Northwest and other places for how you do it. We're doing our very best to be that model. I, by the way, sit on the board of directors in a designated fishing industry seat of the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. That's the nonprofit entity that basically took title to the dams, raised the money, and is responsible for moving forward on restoration. We're in phase 2 now. We're replanting all the emergent lands, beautiful flowers everywhere, nice pictures in National Geographic. And we're also, we have our crews restoring salmon tributaries, spawning and rearing grounds in the tributaries, doing all that stuff. It's not over, but the hardest part was the dam removal.
This is all upward from here, hopefully.
Well, we have people who know what they're doing, have a good reputation. Their performance landmarks that they have to meet over this next 7 to 10 years. The fish are coming back, they're responding, and we want to make it a model.
Definitely, yeah. In terms of the Columbia River decision, do you know the justification given for that?
There is no justification for it. Um, there is every reason to maintain it. It has become a political hot potato. People who are trying to keep the dams alive in spite of the fact that they're no longer functional or need to be replaced are in a sort of a fortress mentality. That's very common. People fear change. The deal that was worked out, a court-ordered settlement, 10-year settlement, which they're trying to trash, did require federal money, but a lot of it will go forward anyway because there is no other option. Um, Keeping the dams, eliminating environmental rules, screwing the tribes has become a far right wing talking point. But if you look at where our economy is, our economy is based on the environment. Ultimately, everything we buy and sell is grown or mined from the environment. Every waste product we throw away has environmental implications. You don't want to foul your own nest, so you don't want to pollute your own nest. Um, Environmental laws are sound economic policy, and our industry shows that really well. We're dyed-in-the-wool environmentalists because we live in the environment. We eat food caught in the environment. It has to be sustainably fished. It has to be sustainably managed, and we cannot allow pollution of those spawning grounds or blocking of those spawning migration areas, which is why our organization, which is a trade association, we're an economic organization, is right at the forefront of the environmentalists, probably in some places pushing and shoving them further than they want to go. Because for us, it's not a hobby, it's not a philosophy, it's a way of life.
Yeah, and to a certain point, it's kind of that these moral obligations as well as these environmental uh activism all have these economic like basis as well, right? So
Exactly,
they're all like interconnected, and
exactly,
advocating for economics is not necessarily like separate from advocating for the environment.
exactly. The Columbia Basin issue was modeled on the Klamath in several ways. If you want to make change, the easiest way is to reduce the frictional costs of getting to where you want to be from where you are. Frictional cost is how much money, how much stress, how many changes have to be made, how many cultural disruptions there will be, all the things that need to be changed in order to have a better outcome. If you can reduce the frictional cost by giving people something valuable to them in return for what they're asked to give up, then you're much better off in terms of moving forward more quickly. In the Klamath, we had two components. One is we would deal with the company's needs. They need to protect their customers. They need to get out from under a huge boondoggle that's going to cost their customers 2.5 times more than dam removal. That was the estimate in terms of keeping the dams. Cost them 2.5 times more than removing them, and cost their ratepayers far more than removing them and replacing the energy. We had the other component which had to do with settling the water disputes in the upper basin, which unfortunately certain members of Congress decided to pickaxe. They basically destroyed it. But that's why we have water problems and conflicts in court over water, but the dams are down. The company got what it needed and got a graceful passage out of the basin and out of the fix that they were in with a deteriorating, decrepit set of dams that generated very little power and were going to cost them a lot of money to save. Now we're working on the water reforms issue. I'll set that aside because it's not related to dam removal, but they were interlinked, which is why even some people in the irrigation community and members of Congress who supported the irrigation community decided to trash the irrigation reform and the water reform portion to get at and destroy the opportunity to remove the dams.
Wow.
We thought ahead on a lot of things. One of the things that we thought ahead on is don't let federal money be the barrier. If you remember the Condit dams and Glines Dam, the authorization, they were on federal land, so they have to be authorized by Congress for removal. The authorization was actually achieved, but it was almost 12 years before they were funded because it was a political hot potato And people thought if we take those dams down, then they're going to come after the Columbia River dams, the domino theory thing. So we couldn't get funding for the dam removal that had already been pre-approved. The engineering specs were all there for 12 years.
Wow.
So in the Klamath, we learned from that we didn't write in federal money. None of the dam removal costs were actually federal money. They were a combination of ratepayers, which almost always pay the cost of building, maintaining, and ultimately taking down dams or replacing them, plus some bond money from the state of California. And the reason the taxpayers were expected to front that is of salmon. If we restore the salmon runs, that restores fisheries all up and down the coast that were then closed frequently because of poor abundance in the Klamath. So that means more jobs. It means hundreds to thousands of more jobs in California. More taxes are paid, more abundance in prosperity in coastal communities. And so it's something that could be basically funded through bond acts for the state and ultimately paid by taxpayers. So that's why that's split. But noticeably, no federal money.
Yeah. So the process is a lot faster because that's the biggest hurdle, right?
Well, it became the biggest hurdle. Remember when we started 10 years earlier in 2005, we really started working on this, maybe actually a little earlier. We were getting encouragement from members of Congress. Congress wanted us to come something from grassroots up, fully supported, broad support, we'll fund it. Everything changed. Politics in Congress changed 180 degrees. It became an anti-government Congress. Um, what were they called? The Tea Party people took over. Uh, and they didn't want to abide by environmental rules. They didn't want to abide by treaty obligations or anything like that. We couldn't get it funded. So the end result is in 2010, we signed the agreement for the two parts, the water reform and the dam removal part. They went together, but one of them needed funding from Congress. That is the irrigation reforms, revising and making the whole irrigation system put on a more sustainable basis. That required funding from Congress. So this particular member of Congress blocked it. Other members of Congress were pushing it. We got it passed twice in the Senate, but we couldn't get it through the House because of the Tea Party activists. And it became a cause célèbre to save our dams. Save our dams. Think about it. This is far right-wing folks who tend to be property rights advocates saying, let's use the force of Congress to keep a company, a private company, from replacing a failed asset that costs its customers more money than taking it down. That was the irony that never really got explained. But it became a cause célèbre. There were two uh, ballot measures. We have a thing called a referendum. You can refer something to the voters. One in Siskiyou County, one in Klamath County. By 79% in Siskiyou County, they voted to save our dams. Save our dams.
Yeah.
Similar Save Our Dams campaign in Klamath, not quite so popular, but it passed there too. Well, they're not publicly owned dams. They're not anything more than a company-owned asset that is no longer viable. And the company's own numbers and the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which licenses the dams and has to relicense them, concluded that keeping the dams would cost on the average of 2.5 times more for its customers than taking them down and replacing the power with modern renewable energy. So the irony is that this big campaign to save our dams, they were never told that they weren't their dams to save. It would be like you being allowed to vote on whether I can sell my car. My
And
old junker isn't worth much. I need to replace it. I want to sell it for what I can get. But let's put it up to a vote, okay? No, that's not how democracies work. Not our democracies, anyway. So anyway, yeah, I'm drifting a little bit across various issues, but suffice to say that we wrote Congress out of the bill, out of the revision. By 2015, we couldn't get the money for the water portions, and that was tied to dam removal. So we just basically redid the deal. We had to abandon the water reforms portion and wrote Congress out entirely. We don't need the Department of Interior to approve it under the new agreement. So we basically says it's going back to the traditional process. We don't need the federal government to sign off. We were trying to avoid the very long, tedious FERC relicensing process or decommissioning process by getting a sign off from the Secretary of Interior. And we had a bill ready to do that, but we couldn't get the bill passed because of the block on dam removal from the right wing Tea Party folks. And so one portion of the deal expired on its own terms, 2015, but the dams are still there. The company still owned the dams, still was liable, still had to do something. Their license had expired, and they were limping along on 1 year renewals while they're trying to figure out what to do. FERC was getting anxious. They have to do something with it, so we rewrote uh, that deal and eliminated any federal oversight or required approval. It went back to, except for FERC, which is a traditional process, it went back to FERC, went through the standard procedure instead of the shortcut that got us into the briar patch. The shortcut didn't pan out. And it was very interesting. There were certain members of Congress who were outraged that we wrote them out and that they could no longer veto it. And they still rant and rave at us, some of them. I won't name names, but it's all a public record which members of Congress opposed dam removal. But they weren't their dams. In Congress, there were even bills introduced saying, "Thou shalt not, you private companies that own dams, remove dams without congressional approval."
even though it's privately owned property.
Even though it's privately owned, that got shot down. It would have been unconstitutional anyway, but they really tried to exert the power of government to violate the private property rights of a company that made a decision based on their economic needs and the needs of their customers. Interestingly enough, when the Trump administration came in, Trump 1.0, first administration,
Um,
the Siskiyou County appealed to the Trump administration to stop dam removal. And the Trump administration sent a special investigator out to meet with everybody, and he said basically, no, this is a private business deal. We don't, as a matter of practice, interfere with private business deal. So we actually had support from the Trump administration to remove the dams because it made sense. It made sense all the way around. Not only just because it would save salmon, but the economics of it. The Pacific Corp is run by accountants. Their obligation is to their customers. It turned out to be much cheaper for their customers to simply replace the power with alternative non fossil fuel sources, which is the trend now in throughout the Northwest and required, than it is to try to patch up an old jalopy. It would be like taking a 1920 tractor and trying to replace each and every part of it
rather than just buying a new car.
rather than buy a new John Deere. Yeah. It would cost you, in special made parts, it would cost you far more than just buying a new tractor.
So to my understanding, it's like the dam removal was advocated by pretty much everyone, like the company that owns it, the people who it's affecting, tribal governments. It just couldn't get past that stage of Congress.
Could get, well, it was opposed by some landowners who have lakefront property, and that's a legitimate beef. It was opposed, I think it was in part opposed by the far right Tea Party incoming members of the House because it was supported by the government. Sort of a knee jerk, they're for it, and so I'm against it. There was no rational reason, and every effort to approach it rationally was pretty much ignored. But in the end, FERC has to operate on rational. They have to, and so do the state agencies. They required water quality certification. We got it, both states. FERC required a plan. We got it, both states. FERC also had never seen an issue quite like this before. Usually it's the company that's on the hook to remove the dams. They built it, they operate it, they make money on it, they take them down. In this case, the company wanted out entirely, so they were giving title over to a brand new nonprofit corporation, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, which was set up for that purpose. One of the company's needs was to get out clean. They won't need a graceful exit. They're going to put in $200 million from their ratepayers. We'll put the money on the table. Somebody else do the dam removal. They're not in the business of removing dams. They're in the business of maintaining and building dams. So that was their need. I've sort of lost the train of the question.
Oh yeah.
Oh, who was opposed to dam removal? A whole bunch of people who had misinformation, people who didn't like that the administration was backing it. Some had legitimate concerns. For instance, the city of Wairika, which is the capital seat of Siskiyou County, their water supply is from a pipe that comes from a spring and it goes underneath the reservoir to protect it. So if you take the reservoir out, it's going to be elevated and will break. It's a very old pipe. That was a legitimate concern. Part of what we did is looked at those legitimate concerns and did what we could to mitigate, replace, or improve the situation. We bought a new system for the city of Wairika. We installed it. It's a brand new fish screens, modern fish screens. It delivers perfect water supply, and it was probably about a $5 to $7 million gift to the city of Wairika to allay their concern about dam removal. That's a legitimate concern. The homeowners around the lake, well, remember this lake was now filled with toxic algae, big warning signs say don't let your dog get in there, don't drink it, don't breathe the air around it, don't boat, don't eat anything in there. Some of them were very depressed about that, but the reality is um, what we're doing with the restoration is creating parklands and recreational facilities and creating a view that will be better than a stagnant lake in the end and will improve, that's the goal, to improve the property values of the people who are there and we're worried about their property values declining. That's why we have a major portion of this dam removal is the restoration portion. So we did everything we could to figure out what were the legitimate interests. For instance, there's a lake. Well, some people says we need water from the lake for firefighting. Actually, the people who actually fight the fires don't use that water. But what we did is we created a system where they had better notice, bought them fire trucks and things like that for the local people to respond more rapidly. We have now a computerized fire spotting system in place. We have a much better communication system, interagency communication system, and we're leaving them in a better condition to fight fires quickly and respond quickly with watering facilities in more places than just leaving the lake alone. Again, looking at the legitimate interests, figuring out a way to mitigate or prevent that kind of potential adverse consequence.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot of nuance, a lot of like even things that seem seemingly unrelated at first, gotta address them eventually.
Yeah. Well, for instance, people worried about flood damage. Is this going to improve or, increase flood risk? Turns out that the dams, all four of them, were not built as flood control dams. The worst flood that ever happened was after the dams were all built,
Wow.
because there's only so much you can do because they only have a capacity. They're not flood control dams at all. There was a minor risk of some increased risk of flood damage around a handful of properties near the river right below Irongate Dam. So we went to each and every one of those. We're still working out some of those and said, okay, what is it going to cost you to flood-proof this house? We'll pay it. Here's a settlement. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to, pay a third to a lawyer. You don't have to do anything. We'll we'll have a fair settlement and we'll give you the money. And if you want to use it to improve flood protection, there you got it. And we've worked out those deals through a separate fund, separately managed by an independent entity, independent former judge in Siskiyou County, who's well respected, former mayor of the town as well, who make those decisions. We don't. We set it up so we fund it, and any damages that happen, for instance, if your well goes dry, you'll need money to drill it deeper. We've got the money there for them. Quick and simple.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. I think I don't want to keep you here too long, but I think talking to you just like has illuminated a lot about like both the dam removal situation as well as the history of the dams. So thank you so much for coming on here and
I've got more time if you want.
oh, all right, that we can stick around for
A
how
little
long?
bit more. Oh, another half hour. I want to go through your questions. Maybe you should ask me some of the actual questions.
Yeah, sounds good. We can go on to the list of questions. I was just worried you had to leave at 2. So, uh,
I talked about the fishing rights and regulations battles and things like that,
so I
and
think we can,
how we resolve that. We basically says, okay, there's a forum. It's called a judge, a court. Let's keep working on all the other stuff.
one thing I did want to touch was kind of going deeper back into history. I know that California, with the gold rush and hydraulic mining, was a big concern uh, for, for a lot of the 1800s and reaching a bit into the 1900s, right? Uh, so I kind of want to expand on what you know about that and how that those lasting effects from hydraulic mining from in the past last on to today and how they're being addressed right now.
There's still a big problem. The Scott River was blasted. The Scott River was one of the refuge areas for a lot of salmon. And there's so much gravel in it from the hydraulic mines. Whole hillsides were washed down into the river. It's a serious problem. The river disappears and goes under the gravel in a number of places every year. We really need to work on that. We also need to work on making sure that we don't dewater the river so much. The Scott and the Shasta. Shasta has different problems, mostly cattle ranches and things like that on the wrong places. Some water diversion problems. Um, the Trinity River, there's a lot of problems in the Trinity. Trinity is the largest tributary and the largest salmon producing tributary of the Klamath. But there's a whole well worked out process of dealing with that, of putting a lot more water back in the Trinity. Originally, 90% of the flow of the Trinity was diverted through a mountain, through a tunnel, into the California Central Valley Project. That was killing all the fish, naturally. You take 90% of the water away and they don't have any fish. So in the year 2000, after many lawsuits and our working with the Hoopa tribes, which is the most affected there in the Trinity, under the Clinton administration, we got a change of policy so that about half of the water remains in the Trinity. And to uh, mitigate for the loss of that other half, a multi-year restoration effort to restore habitat, improve habitat where possible, eliminate mine trailings, move the gravel around that needs to be done. All that is in the works right now. So the Trinity has sort of a separate restoration component.
I heard
Um,
there's a Trinity restoration program also going on recently. I talked to a couple members of the Hoopa tribe and they were talking about it. So I was also wondering what you know about that.
I know a fair bit about it. We helped create that program and lobbied for it for 15 years. So yes, in terms of the details of particular projects on a day-by-day or year-by-year basis, I'm not that familiar. But yes, the mandate there is to restore salmon runs. The salmon runs there suffered all the same problems. There are dams in the upper basin. The water diversion is a major problem. There are water temperature problems that people are working to try to solve. If you have less water with the same amount of sunlight, guess what happens? It heats up higher and stays warmer for longer. That kills a lot of cold water fish. So those things are all being worked out, but they were not dependent on the Klamath Dams deal. They were independent of that, and we made it right clear in the deal itself that this didn't apply to the Trinity. This is one reason the Hoopa tribe never signed on to the Klamath deal, because it didn't really affect their interests except that small area where the main stem passes over the border of their tribal reservation.
Yeah. And kind of bridging into, I guess, more of this relationship between the fishing, commercial fishing, tribal governments. I know you touched on a bit earlier about how these rights are divvied up and how there were some conflicts in the past between tribe, like legal conflicts between tribes and between commercial fishers. How do you think nowadays uh, like the precedent more culturally has been between fishermen and these tribal members? Like I know you mentioned that there's this kind of working relationship, working to improve the rivers and the environment all around. But how do you think this has kind of changed throughout history, I guess?
Well, the tribes got the bitter end of a lot of bad deals. First, the miners killed them off, then the settlers killed them off, and people decertified them as peoples, took their lands, didn't give the land back when they were recertified in the Upper Klamath Basin. What happened to the tribe there? They went from one of the richest, land richest tribes in the country to one of the land poorest tribes in the country. Uh, they were decertified by Congress, and their land was confiscated. And then when they were recertified, they got none of the land back. That's the problem. So there are a lot of problems there. But when you come down to it, the folks who settled from European settlers learned from the tribes how to fish. They learned about salmon. Well, there's a debt of gratitude and a debt of bond that goes back generations in that area. And the other thing is that we realize that we may have started the campaign to take the dams down, and we did, but the people who are going to maintain it are the youth who live there on the river, many of them tribal. Those are the people who are maintaining it now. Those are the people who are in kayaks staging to come down the river for the first time in 100 years, if you saw the New York Times article. Those are tribal youth. And all of us are doing our best. A lot of us are old timers. All of us are doing our best to bring up the next generation to respect the rivers, respect the salmon, and work to preserve them and protect them. So um, the kind of economic and cultural dependence that we have on salmon is large. We're people of the salmon too. But we look to the people who are tribes, and they were deprived of their rivers and deprived in many cases of their salmon for more than 100 years. The irony And when we went, we took every avenue to advocate for dam removal, including taking delegations of tribes, fishermen, and NGO environmentalists to the shareholders meetings of the companies that own Pacific Core. That was Scottish Power back in those days. We had demonstrations, the tribes in full regalia, in the entry to the shareholders meeting of Scottish Power, condemning Scottish Power for maintaining dams that violate Scottish law, which is you cannot maintain and own a dam in Scotland unless it has salmon passage. And we even got a resolution. We had a lot of sympathy from the Scots, who were, an oppressed minority of their own for hundreds of years. There was a lot of camaraderie between indigenous tribal people in Scotland and indigenous tribal people in the American Indians. They have a lot in common. We had such a sympathetic audience there with the people that we actually got a resolution. I think it passed in the Scottish Parliament condemning Scottish Power for owning the dams without putting in fish passage. And I led a delegation of tribal people, and myself and a couple of others, to meet with the financial community in London, the people who are the multi-billion euro backers of Scottish Power, and presented what could easily be called economic genocide being created by the company in the Klamath without anybody knowing it and without it being anything but suppressed in the media in Europe. Keep in mind that 60%, no, 80% of the Yurok tribe reservation has no electric power to this day. So the tribes were promised electrification. They never got it. What they got is a dead river full of dying fish.
Because of the
If
dam.
that isn't the definition of economic genocide, I don't know what is. That was made plain to the I helped make it plain, and Ron Reed from the Crook tribe and I tag teamed to meet with the financial bigwigs, the people who control these funds. They called the CEO of Scottish Power, and we got a call within an hour of that meeting saying, we got to meet. Call off your dogs. We got to meet. Let's see what we can work out. That led to a very tear-jerking meeting where some of our people who were there explained what this really meant to them in terms of their culture and their people. And it turned the company around. From that point on, it was moving toward dam removal, supporting dam removal rather than relicensing. But we were unfortunately too effective. What happened is Scottish Power says, well, let's sell the damn company. So they did and got out of the United States market entirely. The people who bought it were Berkshire Hathaway. So that's why Berkshire Hathaway wound up basically being our target after that in Omaha. We couldn't go to Scotland anymore. Their headquarters was in Omaha. Something of a downer. But we kept at it, meeting with their shareholders. And, the people at the top don't like bad publicity. And they were getting a lot of bad publicity. One of the things that we did is we gave them a way out, a graceful way out of the basin, and the kudos of coming to an agreement which really would benefit the tribes and benefit the salmon and benefit our coastal communities. So all of that was figured into our strategy.
In terms of, I guess I just have like one major thing because I'm going through a list of questions. I think you hit on most of them, just explaining the earlier questions as well. Besides restoration, what do you think is the biggest step to take next?
Water reforms. We have to have a sustainable water supply, not just for minimum survival under the ESA. That's all ESA gets you is minimum survival. We have to have abundance and recovery flows and water quality as well. There are water quality problems from Upper Klamath Lake, which is one of those stagnant, algae-filled bathtubs of nutrients still sitting there. That has to be worked on. We have a lot of water quality problems to solve there. We have two other dams. One is Keno Dam that needs fish passage, that now is owned by the federal government. That was part of the license, but the feds got it because there is some irrigation need for it, and it's a flow regulation dam. It doesn't produce power, but it's flow regulation. That's a good thing. So they now have a dam that they have to put fish passage in so the fish can get up above it. And then Link River Dam, which is right at the mouth of the Klamath, Upper Klamath Lake, that's what guides the water to, it goes left to the irrigation system or it goes right down the river for the fish. And that's screened now. We fought for screens there. Um, the problem with overappropriation is still remaining, and that's in court. We're in and out of court. PCFFA and the Yurok tribes teamed up together as co-plaintiffs in those lawsuits. And we're now before the Ninth Circuit on affirming a ruling in our favor that says that if you've got a conflict between state-based or federal contract water rights based on state water rights and the ESA or tribal treaty obligations, the tribal treaty obligations and the ESA preempt, they prevail. They are superior in right. See, in the water rights system, it's all based on people. If you're a person and you get a water right and your water right is first in time to your neighbors, you're the senior water right holder. Well, where is the water permit for the fish? Where is the water permit for the tribes who are there thousands of years first? They're not recognized under state water law. They are federal obligations. So a ruling that the federal preemption supplants and replaces any conflicting state water right is very important to try to resolve these issues. So we've made that case, and that's the law of the river now. It's been attacked repeatedly by irrigation interests in the upper basin. They're obligated to do that, I suppose. But it's being argued as we speak before the Ninth Circuit to try to reaffirm the law of the river, which is that federal preempts over state.
And I guess another thing I
The
want.
interesting thing is the Biden administration agreed with us 100% and said so to the court. Now the Trump administration's changed 180 degrees and said no. And the court is trying to figure out what to do with an absolutely inconsistent, irreconcilable federal position in two parts of the same case. So we'll see how that goes. We should get a ruling from them in the next six months or so.
Definitely, yeah. So it's like the first, like it passed through the federal government and then the acceptance got rescinded, or
The which?
like since it got accepted by the Biden administration, did it get certification and then that certification got rescinded, or
No, it has always been the law, and it has been for the past 30 years in a case that we intervened in called the Patterson case. It set clearly the rule at the Ninth Circuit that federal law preempts state law when there's a conflict over water rights. But it was ignored by the Bureau, and we had to sue them, and it was ignored by the water users who were doing things like opening the gates, the valves when they're closed by federal marshals, opening them anyway. And it was a lot of big media stuff. So the Bush administration first agreed with the farmers, then the Biden administration and Obama administration agreed with us, and then the Trump administration now flipped from Obama and Biden's position to agree with the farmers again. Their position is that their water rights prevail over federal law, that it's a property right, that it is a legal obligation, that there is no discretion, and discretion is required in order for the ESA to prevail over some action. There's no federal discretion, no federal ESA protections. That's their position. It's wrong. It's wrong on the law, and we are in the process of trying to demonstrate that to the Ninth Circuit right now. Just got the final briefs today, And that's our position.
Hopefully that goes well.
And our position also is that the Trump administration cannot just come and overturn a federal position on a whim. They're not citing any statutes. They're not citing any regulations. They have a self-serving guidance letter, and that's all, a guidance which is non-binding, which they wrote to try to bolster their position. So that's all being argued in court.
Hopefully that goes well, yeah. In terms of, I guess, most people who are going to be listening to this, like the average person within California, what do you think an average citizen's role is in trying to advocate for these environmental reforms and these legal reforms?
I would say the first thing is figure out where you live. What is your watershed? Find out about where your water comes from. Find out about where your water goes when it goes down the drain. Live in that watershed. One of the most important planning reforms that California made is they plan now more and more on the basis of watersheds rather than counties. Counties were, the lines of counties are drawn for stupid reasons, for lots of different arbitrary reasons. Watersheds are real. So I would say that every citizen should know what their watershed is, what's happening in their watershed, and work to protect it. That's the most important thing any of us I can do. What's the old saying? The person who knows the true value of water is the person whose well is run dry.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't heard that saying.
And Mark Twain.
Uh,
Um, yeah, you. We can't live without water, and California is water limited and grossly overappropriated. One scientific study, peer-reviewed science study, is basically they counted up all the water permits, water rights on one side, and the total amount of water in all the rivers on the other side. The permits are roughly 5 times higher than the actual water in all the rivers in California. In some places, even more overappropriated than that.
wow.
But on average, California is 5 times overappropriated according to this scientific study. It's the only one of its kind because, frankly, the government doesn't want to know. So the government could never do this study. It was done privately by scientists at UC Davis about 5 years, 6 years ago.
Yeah. So I guess the biggest step, everyone, is to kind of just like investigate where your own water comes from, do a bit more
Yeah,
about how it is for yourself.
exactly. You know, if you want to be an environmentalist, all you have to do is look at your environment and see what you can do to make it better and to protect what you've got. That's fundamental. That's fundamental to a civilized society. You can't foul your nest. You can't pollute the people downriver. You know, and we have a system where you can take the profits and externalize all the deficits, all the pollution, just put it in a river and put. Well, we're the people in the river. We're the people downriver of the river. So the fishing industry is where it all settles. That's why we are losing our salmon. That's why we're losing the value of our estuaries. 90% of the estuaries in California are gone. That is the most abundant, biologically important area of any coastline is the estuaries. So we've got to work to recover what we can get. We have to work to live within sustainable limits. There's a lot we need to do, but it's all doable. This is I'm more than an optimist. I'm a pragmatist optimist. I'm pragmatic that it's going to take work to protect our environment and really restore our watersheds and groundwater particularly. But I know it can be done, and if we all work together, it can be done. The the Sigma uh, sustainable I forget what Sigma means, but basically Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, sustainable Sigma. That's a step in the right direction. Um, California, by the way, you live in California?
Yeah, I live in
Yeah,
California.
I figured you do. California is the only state in the country that does not have legal control at the state level of its groundwater. In California, it's county based. So your county can issue permits to take water out of the aquifer they have in common with other counties. Every county has the incentive to take as much water as quickly as possible for their people as they can. So you create a race to the bottom, the tragedy of the commons in short form, a race to the bottom. Then you have over-appropriated agriculture. So if there's not enough rain, which in many years there isn't, they have to pump it from the groundwater. And you have subsidences up to 70 feet, I've heard. In some places, over the last 100 years, the ground has sunk. And you have canals now running backwards. You have breaking. You have train tracks breaking because the ground is sinking under them. One of the big problems with trying to create the bullet train, the rapid transit speed train, is you can't find a place to put the tracks where they're not being stressed by ground subsidence. It would be unsafe. That's one of the problems. All of that is hitting the fans now. People are trying to grapple with how to restore groundwater. They're trying to grapple with what to do with flood waters that used to infiltrate naturally into the groundwater. They didn't flood in the past the way they do today. So we're getting there, and the techniques are all there. We have to implement them. We have to move them forward. And for me, it starts with the fish. Ask where the fish go, where they're from, and protect where they're from. Those river systems, those habitats. Uh, that's food and on the table and bread and butter for my folks.
Yeah. And food is important for everyone too. Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, it was really, really insightful listening to you. So once again, thank you so much for speaking and talking to
A
me.
pleasure. Always a pleasure.